What is social isolation doing to us from the standpoint of the brain?
For our brains, being alone, being isolated, is a form of stress because it's a threat. And so the reason that's bad is because in long-term stress, a bunch of things can happen, but one of the most threatening is chronic inflammation.
So maybe you can describe for us the difference between being happy alone and loneliness.
So loneliness is the state of feeling your social needs aren't met. On the other hand, isolation is just the pure state of being alone. I really genuinely think that the amount of time older people spend alone is like one of the greatest, maybe unspoken health crises of our human existence. The older you get, the higher the mortality risk goes up for isolation. So for those above 65, being isolated is associated with a 78% higher risk of death in men and 57% higher risk of death in women. If we decide to allow AI chatbots to be our friends and we start to respect them as peers, and so if you can flip the switch on that brain area that says, no, this actually isn't a robot, this is a human being, then what happens to humanity? I think it gets worse. And that's what I'm really worried about.
Dr. Ben Rein, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. Our mutual friend Joe Zundel, who's a cancer biologist, he's spoken very highly of you. Our other mutual friend, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, said that you are just the GOAT when it comes to all things neuroscience. I was just on Dr. Jolene Brighton's podcast yesterday, and the remnants of your presence were still to be felt in the room. So I'm excited to celebrate your new book, Why Brains Need Friends. I'm excited to have a conversation about social connection and its value from a neurobiological perspective. But one thing that really stood out to me is that you, as a neuroscientist, you've said that your research has completely changed your own social life. How?
I think this happens for a lot of people. They go through whatever road to expertise they take, right? And through that path, their perspective broadens completely on a topic. And that's what happened to me with studying social behavior. So I've always, focused on social behavior from various angles. I studied the genetics of autism in my PhD, and then the neurobiology of empathy in my postdoc, and just all the way along. When you get so involved in a topic and you get so deep in the minutia, you start to just notice all these little things about the daily world and the world we all inhabit that other people don't typically think about. And I don't know, I just tend to think a lot more deeply about everyday interactions, and especially their importance and significance for well-being. And given the current sort of road we're on, where people are spending less time together, the average number of friends is going down. The amount of time spent alone monthly and weekly is on the rise, and loneliness is a problem. That whole issue, which I've heard about on podcasts before and news articles and whatnot, I just felt that there was a neuroscience angle not being presented, right? Like imagine if you saw a news article that was like, this just in, like not getting enough sleep is bad for you, and people were like, because that's kind of what's happening with socializing, right? We're aware that we should be more social and that isolation's bad, but I don't really think we're acting on it. And so my perspective is like, okay, I understand what this does for the brain when we do socialize, when we don't socialize. And so the reason I wrote the book was to get that information out and help people understand like what's actually going on and why does this matter.
You hear a lot about, the so-called loneliness epidemic. What is social isolation doing to us from the standpoint of the brain? Like how is it as harmful as it's often presented?
Yeah, so there's two sides to this coin. One side is socializing is good for you. The other side is isolation is bad for you. So when you're isolated, it's not only bad for you, but you're also missing out on the upside of socializing. So it's kind of this binary thing. So, but let's focus on isolation. Isolation is a form of stress. It is perceived by the body as stress. And so when we're isolated, our cortisol levels go up. We have this HPA axis activation, and of course, stress is not good for you. It's unhealthy. And by the way, the reason for that is because, I tend to look at all of this through an evolutionary lens because it always makes sense if you think about, a long, years and years, million years ago, what was going on for the human body. And at that point, survival of the fittest meant survival of the most social for humans, because those who were able to work together in groups were better hunters, they were better at defending themselves. And so for our brains, being alone, being isolated, is a form of stress because it's a threat. In that time, if you were cast out from your tribe, you were literally at a much higher likelihood of dying. And so our world has changed dramatically, society has changed dramatically, but we still have the exact same piece of hardware in our brains. Maybe not exact same, maybe a few changes in a million years, but generally the same. And so when we're apart from others, we experience stress, our cortisol goes up. And so the reason that's bad is because in long-term stress, a bunch of things can happen, but one of the most threatening is chronic inflammation. So cortisol is anti-inflammatory, actually, in short-term periods of stress. And that's because it's preparing your body to fight. You want to be ready for stress. But in long-term stress, what can happen is the body sort of desensitizes to that cortisol. And so when it should normally be anti-inflammatory, it's no longer having that property. And so inflammation can build up over time with chronic stress and therefore cause chronic inflammation. That seems to be like the major issue in social isolation that's associated with all of the health problems. So you've probably heard the statistic, being isolated is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, right? Like that was in the loneliness epidemic paper and people started citing that. And, it's not that being isolated causes lung cancer, right? It's not like a direct one-to-one. It's that if you look at the mortality risk, just the pure chance of dying by any cause from being isolated, it's really bad. And it's apparently comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And there's studies showing, for instance, in like 300,000 people, you track them for a decade, and you segment their mortality risk, chance of dying, based on their social kind of immersion, how social their lifestyle is. And that study found that those in the lowest portion of socializing, who were very isolated, were 50% more likely to die by any cause.
Wow.
So you think, okay, what does that mean? Like how is that happening? Well, chronic inflammation is probably one of the core mechanisms there. And, there's a lot of talk about inflammation. People often it's a complicated topic. It's tough to get right. And it's often just kind of thrown out there. And it's like, well, that's probably chronic inflammation. Like this actually, there seems to be some strong evidence that it is. Because when there is chronic inflammation, especially as we're getting older, we're just much less resilient to any sort of health problem that might pop up, like a heart attack or heart disease. And so being socially isolated is associated with increased risk of heart disease, diabetes, dementia. Those with dementia who are isolated, their memory declines twice as fast. So you take all these things together, and it kind of makes sense that the body's tissues are just not functioning properly because we're under this sort of chronic stress response. And so I want people to take it seriously because it does matter. And sure, it's not a guarantee that if you're isolated that you're going to have a heart attack or anything like that. And I don't mean to sound the alarms, but the data are very clear that being isolated is a very significant a bane to health.
So causally though, social isolation can actually cause inflammation?
Yeah, so that's a tough experiment to do. What has been done that has been shown in animal models. In humans, it's more well known that stress causes inflammation, and and isolation is a form of stress.
Got it.
So,
wow. Yeah, this is fascinating. And I'm sure you're familiar with that 80-year-long study from Harvard, the study on adult flourishing or adult development. I forget the exact name of it, but we had the lead researcher in about a year ago, I think, at this point. And of course, that's an observational study, and correlation doesn't equal causation. But would you say that in a way your research helps sort of paint a mechanistic explanation as to why it seems that social connection is one of the most valuable variables when it comes to living a long and healthy life? Yeah,
I think so. And there's another study kind of pretty similar to that about superagers that just came out very recently. And superagers are people who, I forget the exact criteria. I think it's they're over 80 years old, but their brains are comparable in health status, and their cognitive function is similar to people 20 years younger. And so it's what's making these people age so gracefully? And their brains are, larger, because as we age, the brain naturally shrinks, unfortunately, just a part of aging. But these people didn't show that. And so, what is it? What's going on here? And what the study found that just came out is that the one unifying factor of all these superagers is that they're all extremely social. They're all very extroverted, and they all live very social lives. And they look in the brain and they find, like I said, certain areas are larger, and we can get into the details of that. But one of the other things they found is lower inflammatory markers in the brains of these superagers. Of course, when they died, and then they did, postmortem analysis of the brains. So yeah, it makes it's there's a lot of evidence out there already, but so it seems like every like month there's another thing that's just pointing once again to socializing is important. And one thing I do want to point out, which is really important, is I always fear when I have conversations like this and I share all these horrifying statistics that people are going to be like, I'm going to die, right? Like I'm not socializing and I need to do way more. And there's no way I could ever sort of meet this standard of what this jackass on a podcast is talking about. And that's not really true. I think what it's important to recognize is that we all fall somewhere on a continuum of introversion to extroversion. And this is like a measurable trait that, it's pretty stable. People say like, oh, I'm really introverted sometimes and extroverted other times. No, it's really just like you have a trait level of extroversion. And, of course, sometimes you're more outgoing, more energetic. Other times you're more quiet. But the level of extroversion that you sort of land at determines your brain's social needs, basically. And so in the book, I propose this idea of a social diet, that we all have a different social diet, and it's comprised of, different feeding styles, right? Maybe sometimes people interact once a day or 3 times a day or 0 times a day or whatever it is. And the interactions we have are all different, and those may be providing different sort of forms of nourishment for the brain, not like in terms of glucose, but in terms of, all the great things socializing does for the brain. And so it's important for anybody to figure out sort of what the proper cadence of socializing is, because it doesn't necessarily mean like when I'm talking about these super agers that they're all extroverted and they're living to 80 and their brains look amazing. A super introverted person who does that and tries to be really extroverted all the time just for the sake of trying to live to 150, probably not going to work because it's fatiguing their brain, right? It's overdoing something. And so I like to use this analogy of like a plant, right? All plants need to be watered. That may be wrong. Sorry if there's any plant scientists out there. I think all plants need to be watered.
I think so.
But some plants need more water, other plants need less water. And that's kind of how like our social lives are. So really extroverted people, the plant needs to be watered often. That's how much interaction they need. They need to be socializing frequently. Whereas an introvert may only need to be watered once a week. You go out with friends a couple hours, you feel better. And the key is kind of, there's a point where the plant is overwatered, where you're at a party for 6 hours and you're like, oh my God, I need to go home. Like this is enough. And then there's a part where the plant is too dry, right? And it really needs to be watered. And if you let the plant hang out at that underwater dry stage for too long, it's bad for the plant. Similarly, I think we need to be better about recognizing when we're at the bottom of that watering, when we're really not getting enough interaction. And it's a shame because humans are really, really good at detecting, okay, that's enough interaction for me, but we're not quite as good at being like, I think I'm lonely, right? Because when we feel bad and we're stressed or something feels off, we feel kind of flat, there's so many other culprits we can point to where it's like, maybe I didn't get a good night of sleep last night, or I had a coffee late in the day yesterday, or I'm really stressed out at work, or I'm in that argument with my sister, or whatever. There's so many things you can place above socializing. And so what I'm really hoping that my book and sort of my messaging will do is get people to start considering, oh, you know what, I haven't actually really left the house in a couple of days and had a really good interaction with friends. Or last time I went out into my community, that person at the grocery store gave me that dirty look and it made me feel bad, and I've been feeling kind of disconnected from my community. And like, I want that to start entering the conversation in a very serious way where people will recognize this actually does matter for mood and just general health.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the terminology that you've coined, the social diet. I think that's crucially important. I mean, it's like everybody can kind of get a sense of, especially people who travel often, who are on the road a lot, like myself, I can, like, my body just feels different when I've just, when I've been on the road and I haven't had access to my usual way of eating. Maybe I've been going particularly hard on the ultra processed foods because that's all that's been available to me to quench my hunger. So I like this idea of sort of turning it inward and being able to self-assess, self-identify when, more social nutrition is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And also what social meals are you having, right? Like, I think that's another thing that people kind of, I don't know, maybe don't take seriously, but we all have different social preferences as well, right? So you might hate going to parties, but that's all you do because that's all your friends invite you to, right? But you hate being elbow to elbow and you don't like really drinking alcohol, but this is how you spend your time socially. That's actually something that you should consider. Maybe you really prefer one-on-one interactions like this over a coffee, and or vice versa. Maybe you feel really uncomfortable in one-on-one interactions, but your friends always invite you out for one-on-one coffees. Like, it's okay to try optimizing your diet or your social diet or changing it to suit your needs. And so one of the sort of practices that I propose in the book is social journaling. So you come home from a interaction, like anything, party, one-on-one coffee, whatever it is, and there's a bunch of prompts in the book of like, where were you, what time was it, how many people were you with, all those things, and trying to get at what elements of a social experience suit your needs and really make you feel good and what don't. And that simple practice maybe a lot of people haven't done. And it seems kind of just intuitive to me, but I don't know. I don't think we interrogate our social lives the same way that we interrogate other things, like, oh, I slept on that pillow last night and I don't feel so good, or I had ramen last night and my stomach hurts now, so I'm not going to have ramen again, right? But we go about our social lives as if they are some sort of leisurely activity that we don't really think too much about, right? It's something we do for fun or something we do out of obligation. But
it's like a nice to have, but...
Yeah, but it's not something that we do for our health. And when you start to see it that way, it's like, oh, yeah, maybe I should kind of think a little bit about the social experiences that I'm curating for my brain because maybe they matter.
Now, you've mentioned that, which is very... I was glad to hear that being an introvert is not a natural sort of decrement to your health. Like, you're not at a disadvantage just for being an introvert. So maybe you can describe for us the difference between being alone and being happy alone and loneliness.
Yeah. So what you just said is isolation versus loneliness, right? So loneliness is the state of feeling your social needs aren't met. So like yesterday at my hotel, they were having like a rooftop party. And I was like, I'm traveling alone. And I thought, yeah, you know what, I'm going to go. And so I went up and there's people hanging out. And I was like, oh, this is a cool vibe. I'll hang out for a little bit. And I didn't know anybody. And I sat at a table and I got a cocktail. And I was just sitting there and I was so incredibly lonely despite being surrounded by all these people. And I use that example to point out something we've all kind of experienced. You can be lonely in a crowd. But then on the other hand, isolation is just the pure state of being alone, right? When I go back to my hotel room and I'm sitting there by myself, I am in that moment isolated. And so both of these things are bad. There is some research suggesting that they may have slightly different effects on health, but they're both bad overall. And as for introverts and extroverts, the thing to understand is, yes, introverts are not necessarily at some sort of additional risk, but they may be if they sort of cave too much to their natural desire to be alone, and so they never water the plant, right? And I think that's what I really want people to take from this, is that it's perfectly healthy and acceptable and fine for your body to be an introvert as long as you're still getting some level of interaction. And there's actually research where introverts are put into social environments and basically like mandated to be extroverted. They say, just try to be as outgoing as you can, socialize, whatever. And if it's a short-term interaction, like a 10-minute or 1 hour or even like one day, they actually report feeling better afterwards. So having a social interaction is not necessarily inherently bad for introverts. But if they extend that study and they do it for a whole week, and they have to be extroverted for 1 week, that's where they start to get super burnt out and feel, like they're not being authentic to themselves. They just feel tired. They feel worse. Whereas a natural extrovert, someone who scores higher in trait extroversion, they feel great at the end of the week because they're doing exactly what their brain wants. And so I think it's important to focus on that single, one interaction, going out for 1 hour, person feels good, even if they are introverted. I think I want to encourage people to raise the floor a little bit, right? Like, you don't necessarily need to top out the ceiling. You just need to raise the floor so that you're not getting no interaction, you're getting some interaction, and so you're avoiding loneliness and isolation, because that's where, the downsides fall, especially when it's sustained, right, for a long period of time.
From the standpoint of neuroscience, does the depth of the relationship modify the impact that it has on our brains?
Yeah, absolutely. So certain relationships are like a level above. Okay, so let's get into a conversation about oxytocin for a second here. So oxytocin, most people have heard as like the love hormone, has something to do with social bonding, right? That's true. What it really does in the brain is it drives social reward. So when we are having a pleasant interaction and you enjoy the presence of the person you're interacting with, your brain is probably releasing oxytocin. And that oxytocin is driving the release of two other neurotransmitters that everyone has heard of, dopamine and serotonin. By the way, that combination of dopamine and serotonin, there's only a few drugs in the world that trigger that, and one of them is MDMA, ecstasy, or Molly. So the fact that oxytocin triggers the same brain systems as ecstasy tells us about, this is going to maybe sound wrong at first, but why socializing is so good for us. That does not imply MDMA is good for you, but that that's maybe why we experience such profound mood benefits from socializing, is because our brains tell us this feels good. And that's because 1 million years ago, having a reward system to motivate us to interact encouraged our survival. And so now we have these things in our brains. Okay, anyway, so oxytocin is driving this social reward reinforcement. It's reinforcing the presence of that person. So when you fall in love with someone, there's a ton of oxytocin because your brain is telling you, this person is fantastic. You absolutely love being around them. And, those who have ever experienced falling in love can probably relate to that feeling of like, you just want to be around that person. Like you never want to be apart. It's because the brain is like, it's literally triggering dopamine release, right?
It's limerence, yeah.
Yeah, it is inherently reinforcing. So oxytocin is particularly high in our bodies when we are experiencing like love for a romantic partner and love for our children. So I mentioned that certain relationships are sort of a level above. Those are the two in particular. And what's amazing about oxytocin that's not often discussed, or I've never really heard anyone discuss it, is that it's not just a social bonding chemical in the brain. It's also like very healing, you could say. It's actually been called nature's medicine by certain researchers because when we have higher oxytocin, it's associated with benefits like neuroprotection. It's also anti-inflammatory. It can be supportive of immune function. Bone growth is actually oxytocin receptors on bones, which is interesting.
Whoa.
There's a bunch of evidence in animal models that can be supportive for anxiety and stress response and things like that, and some in humans too. So you think, okay, why is oxytocin so healing? Well, when you have these opportunities to fall in love and reproduce, which is like the hallmark of evolution, right? The best two things you can do as a human on Earth in the eyes of evolutionary forces are to survive and reproduce, right? So when you have an opportunity, you're falling in love, you can reproduce right now, your body should be as healthy as possible to ensure that you can reproduce. You successfully reproduce, you have even more oxytocin, you're falling in love with this child. Once again, it's important for you to be healthy to successfully raise the child. And so it's important to, I think, recognize that experiencing these deep social bonds also pays off in terms of protecting our health and well-being. And from my read of the literature, which is very kind of confusing, oxytocin is an indicator of like desire to bond, and so it makes sense that we have a strong desire to bond with our romantic partner and our children. But I would think that it's probable that the level of oxytocin we release is also related to sort of the strength of the connection we have with a friend or with anybody, right? So if you meet somebody and you really hit it off and you think this person's great, I really would like to spend more time with them, it's probable that that's having a more positive, reinforcing, and maybe more healthy overall systemic effect on your body.
Can you, say you don't have a romantic partner and say you don't have children, maybe you don't want children, can you approximate the benefits of being in a romantic relationship and having children with, physical touch? You often hear that oxytocin is sometimes described as the hugging hormone as well.
Yeah, it does. So oxytocin does, So physical touch does, let's just cut that and read it. Okay, so that's right. So social touch does trigger oxytocin release. And yeah, it's actually been shown that massage doesn't really matter. All sorts of people. It could be a professional, it could be a friend, it could be a romantic partner. It has all sorts of health benefits and sort of, it's good for you. But actually the oxytocin level that is driven by the massage is higher if it's a romantic partner. And it's really interesting. There's some studies. This is where I get this idea that the level of oxytocin you produce is related to your sort of desire to bond with the person. So there's studies showing that if you had people come in, so there's one study where they had heterosexual men, that's important, come into a lab and they met a male researcher and a female researcher. And then they put them in a brain scanner, and they like dangled a sort of cloth over the bottom of the tube so the people couldn't see their legs. And then they got a massage, a foot massage or a leg massage, or they were like tickled on their leg or something like that. And for some of the men, they were told that the person touching them was the female researcher. This is where the heterosexual part comes in. For others, they were told that it was the male. Both times it was the female, actually, kind of irrelevant. But when they thought it was the female, they showed a much greater level of oxytocin release. And also they showed different brain activity, higher activity in brain areas associated with this like positive social touch. So could that be because, their brain is trying to, and by the way, also they reported that the touch felt better too, which might be because the oxytocin is making them feel more connected with the person and the hands, the hands or the person that the hands belong to. So there's other studies too showing the same thing in couples, right? You bring a couple in and they either are told that this is it's your romantic partner who is massaging your legs, or it's this researcher you just met. When it's the romantic partner, they also show those same general differences. And then another study that kind of confirms all this is they had a robot massage people's legs, or they had a human. And when it was a human, they also showed higher oxytocin release, which to me says, as great as it may be sometimes to sit in those massage chairs at the mall or the airport, right? Your brain knows it's a robot. And so there's no purpose in releasing oxytocin because there's no entity to form a social bond with. When it's a human, that oxytocin is released, but when it's a robot, even if the massage feels great, there's much less oxytocin released. And so it seems like maybe if you like your massage therapist a lot, it might have like better effects on you, and you might actually experience the sensation as being better. So it does matter who we are interacting with, and in the context of social touch, who's massaging us.
That is fascinating, because you often hear that massage just feels good, but that you're explaining a mechanism by which there might be enduring health benefits to human touch by way of massage. I mean, not only is that awesome for people who enjoy getting massages, such as myself, but also, it's great for people who aren't necessarily in a relationship. Mm-hmm. So they can basically just buy their way into achieving some of those health benefits.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before, but that is true. And I can't help myself. I have to also point out dogs as a potential supplement to a social diet, because dogs also trigger oxytocin release. And I couldn't tell you how that compares in terms of quantity to human touch or your best friend or whatever. But dogs, just like how humans survive best in groups, and so this oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin sort of glues us together to hold us so that we survive. Dogs also, 30 or 40,000 years ago, came into the equation, and we survive, both humans and dogs survive better together. And so we have the same sort of social bonding systems at play with dogs. So when we are looking into the eyes of our dog, for instance, both the human and the dog show a rise in oxytocin.
Whoa.
So if you have no social contact whatsoever, but you have a dog and you're getting regular massages, maybe there's some value there. Because, and I actually do genuinely believe that if for older people who are more isolated, because we do spend time more and more alone as we get older, at least in the US, that's a problem, because that isolation coincides with a period of life where we are very delicate and fragile, and we are more susceptible in general to all sorts of health conditions. Throw on top of that the fact that we're socializing less, and so we're just making matters worse. Maybe a dog could help a little bit by sort of providing some of the same social brain stimulation that a human interaction can. And I really genuinely think that the amount of time older people spend alone is one of the greatest, maybe unspoken health crises of our maybe human existence, but at least of our time. Because there's data showing that basically the older you get, the higher the mortality risk goes up for isolation. So for those above 65, being isolated is associated with a 78% higher risk of death in men and 57% higher risk of death in women. So plus, as I mentioned, dementia, it accelerates dementia, increases the risk for dementia. It's just not good. So I have a section in the book called Visit Your Grandparents, where I basically, reassure that. And also, by the way, this is from mice because we can't do this experiment in humans, but there's one study where they sort of simulated visiting your grandparents in mice. I guess they could do that study in humans, but not in an experimental way, but in more in an observational way. But so what they had was these old mice that were very old, and then they had them spend 15 minutes a day with a younger mouse. And what they found was that just 15 minutes a day extended their life by an average of 33%. So they lived a third longer lives from just 15 minutes a day of interacting. And they also showed all sorts of like muscle benefits. They were better at like walking a tightrope and things like that. It just improved longevity in these mice. So
wow,
please visit your grandparents.
Yeah.
And parents.
Wow. That makes a ton of sense. What about cats? Any research on cats? I get that the spectrum of affection that you get from cats is way wider than it is for dogs. So I can totally understand why you'd see such a consistent benefit from dog ownership. But like, I have an extremely affectionate cat, and I would be shocked if like there was not that oxytocin exchange happening between me and my cat.
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
There definitely is.
I'm sure there is. I mean, in general, cats, like certain cats, or maybe I don't really know that much about cats, to be honest, but I believe most cats are solitary species, right? And the interesting thing about solitary species is that they're wired the opposite of us, where when they are alone, they don't show a stress response, and when they're around others, they do show a rise in cortisol. So their brains are wired in the exact opposite of ours to encourage their survival or the conditions that they survive best in. But with cats, I mean, there's got to be some changes. I truly don't know, but there's got to be some changes in the brains of domestic cats that do make them sweethearts. Because I had a cat growing up, 2 cats, and one was like one of those flat-faced cats that and she was like scared of everything. Like you couldn't even, it was like 10 years into our relationship that she finally sat on my lap. It was amazing. But my other cat, Mikey, was super, super social, and I'm sure there's a similar thing going on there. But since humans and dogs have had this, 30 to 40,000 year relationship, there's really something special there. But there is evidence that having a pet in general, whether it's a horse or a lizard, I mean, obviously looking into the eyes of your gecko isn't going to stimulate oxytocin release, but there's something beneficial about, the accompaniment that they provide. So.
Yeah, very super interesting. I mean, my cat is so affectionate and expressive, and like, she's definitely we definitely have a strong bond. What about micro interactions? I mean, what's the value of those? Like, I definitely feel sometimes all it takes for me is interacting with the person that I'm getting coffee from, like the barista, or saying hi to the person who flags me in at the gym that I go to. Yeah,
100%. I mean, there also is evidence. I hate to always point to science, but I guess it is useful because people are like, yeah, no, I've interacted with a person in that way, but what happens when you study it? I mean, there is evidence that people feel better after even those tiny interactions, like thanking your bus driver on the way out. I was actually just thinking about this morning because I went for a walk and I passed someone on the street or on the sidewalk, and I just said, good morning, and she said, good morning, and I thought, wow, that was really nice. It's something as simple as that. It really makes you feel a lot more embedded in your community and just connected with the people around you. And, one of my concerns is that, sure, we see socializing is declining and isolation is rising. And I think we often associate that with like big changes, like COVID was a huge change. And, we have remote work and social media and all these big things. But there are all these micro interactions that are kind of also being stripped away through the current changes in culture. And there's so many, like you can name pretty much anything. Like even you have a coffee here, you could have walked in and spoken to the barista, or you could have Instacarted it or Uber Eats or whatever and had it delivered and at your doorstep where you don't even have to interact with the person. You could do that for your groceries. You could do that for so many things. You could deposit a check at an ATM or on your phone. You can even see a doctor on telemedicine, right, without actually leaving your house or going face to face. And so we have all these, I call this convenient automation, right? We've automated all these things for the sake of convenience that remove a bunch of social interactions. And I think, yes, the acute small experience of that interaction is helpful and is supportive and is it's like a snack in your social diet, right? But when the cumulative whole of that, when you're taking out all these interactions and you're just not engaging with your community as much, I think, yes, we spend more time alone, but we also just feel less connected to our communities in general. And, I think what I've heard a lot of people describe in the last few years is this sensation of being like not as embedded in humanity as before, right? You don't feel like a sense of belonging, right? And I've had a few experiences where someone was exceptionally nice to me and kind, and it like rushed back of like, wow, I'm actually proud to be human. This was such an incredible show of kindness and compassion that I'm grateful to be here on earth with all these people who are capable of this experience and delivering this gift of joy and kindness to me. But we don't really experience that as much because with maybe those small interactions taken out, we don't have the opportunity, for something like that to happen, or someone in the grocery store picks up something you dropped and, oh, here's your wallet. I think you dropped it. And you're like, wow, that really makes me feel good. And I do worry about that, especially, this is sort of a tangent, but especially if we start turning to AI replacements of human contact, which further makes it more convenient to just sit on your couch and you can, simulate an interaction on your phone or something like that.
Well, are AI interactions better than no interactions at all? I mean, they are getting pretty damn close to approximating what it's like to converse with another human. I mean, like if AI hasn't already passed the Turing test, I'd be shocked. Like I sometimes can't even, like it's shocking to me interacting with, for example, ChatGPT, that I'm not interacting with a real human.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the answer. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that, how it compares to human or to no interaction. But yeah, I think that we're headed for a world where AI agents are kind of embedded and probably humanized. There's already tools that allow you to befriend. You can like kind of make a friend that's AI powered, and interacting with them feels like you're interacting with a human. And I think there's probably certain contexts where that's super beneficial and useful. And there is a little bit of research on that. Like, for example, those who were victims of sexual assault, if they have AI interactions that are sort of like simulated dates or simulated romantic exchanges where there's no risk, there's no threat, it can actually be useful for sort of re-emerging and overcoming the trauma. But that's a super specific use case, right? If we start to just sort of, replace human contact with AI, I don't think it's going to be good for us because, thinking back to that study I just mentioned about the robot massage versus the human massage, right? If we recognize that we are interacting with an AI chatbot, there's probably something in our brain that sort of gatekeeps the human element, right? And we certainly have brain areas that are devoted to understanding the social nature of touch or interaction and social cues and things like that. And I think that the absence of those on virtual interactions is why we maybe don't experience as much joy or empathy online. But the thing that I just keep coming back to on the AI question is that I think we hold the keys to this decision, right? Like we are the first generation of humans right now to ever engage with AI human-like agents. And the way that we choose to welcome them into our lives, to what extent we allow that, will determine the future of humanity. Like if we decide collectively to befriend AI chatbots, like genuinely befriend them, our children and our grandchildren will think it's completely normal, right? And we hold that decision right now, and there's some public discourse around it, but we're really not like making any decisions deliberately, but we are making decisions kind of passively in the way that we do every day engage with new AI tools. And I worry that at some point we're going to kind of, get onto the other side of this hill and start just flying where we're thinking it's totally normal to have AI agents and AI chatbots and AI friends. There's nothing wrong with AI chatbots. I use AI chatbots all the time for work purposes, right? Hey, can you make this email sound more professional, please? Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I even go in there and I'm like, struggling with this decision on my plate. Here's what I know. Is there anything else out there that I'm not finding? Can you do a Google search for me? And like, it's super helpful, but I'm not going in there and being like, how's your week? Like I want to hang out. Because I do think that if we go that route, then we'll be just exacerbating our loneliness issue and going even further into this canyon of isolation that we're in.
You see the movie Companion?
No.
Oh, it was a good movie. It paints this like picture of a dystopic future where we're not just in relationships with AI bots, but we're in sexual, romantic relationships with them. And it kind of shows it's a horror movie.
Oh,
so you can kind of picture how it
Perfect.
all goes down. But do you personally think that it's dystopic, the direction that we're heading in, or are you more optimistic?
I think it could go either way. I mean, I think that there's a role in human life that AI agents could occupy, and one that's actually really supportive and helpful. Like, I imagine everybody has a sort of personal assistant, that's an AI chatbot, and it's like, hey, can you email, Max's chatbot, and let's, sort out lunch or whatever. Great, that's time saving, right? But I think it could also go a not so good route where we sort of allow them to cross that threshold of like respecting them as peers and colleagues and romantic partners. And it's already happening, by the way. There are online tools for like designing a AI lover, and you can like customize their features. And I'm sure some of them have like intimate simulations or something like that. There's a peer-reviewed like scientific paper on that I read that was interesting, where basically one of those online tools took that feature away, and people were like revolting. They were super mad that it was gone, and saying that it was like really essential to the AI like companion experience. And I think that's kind of where I get this idea that we can collectively get over this barrier. Like it's purely perception, right? Like if we decide to allow AI chatbots to be our friends and we start to respect them as peers, like you said, it's convincing, right? It's easy to do. And so if you can flip the switch on that brain area that says, no, this actually isn't a robot, this is a human being, then what happens to humanity? I think it gets worse. And that's what I'm really worried about. Although maybe it doesn't, because maybe if we flip that switch on, maybe the benefits are equivalent to human contact. I don't know. It is like a horror movie, honestly, that we're currently in.
It kind of is. I mean, but yeah, there was recently, I remember seeing pushback to OpenAI recently when they made the switch by default from ChatGPT 4.0 to 5. There was people were complaining that the personality had been wrung from it, which it's like you're thinking like, why does my chatbot need to have a personality? It's there for accomplishing tasks. It's playing ultimately, for many people, I think, see it more as being a utilitarian tool. But many people apparently do interact with it and derive some kind of value from it having a personality of sorts.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are, like the sexual assault example I gave, I do think that there are similar other contexts where it can be really useful. And especially, maybe for those with like very high social anxiety, where they're able to get some form of meaningful contact with an AI chatbot that otherwise wouldn't be possible with humans. Who knows? But I think that, for us to expect a personality and stuff, that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about like our children and our grandchildren, right? Like right now, we don't really look for a personality. We might notice a personality, but we don't expect a personality from an AI chatbot because to us, it's simply a tool. But maybe our children and our grandchildren will expect a personality and expect to form a connection. And who knows? It could go any way. Maybe it'll turn out that actually that's helpful, and that even though people understand, oh, this is a AI chatbot, having a relationship with it maybe makes them better work companions. Who knows? We don't know where it's going to go, but I do have concerns for sure.
Is there any data that you can share about virtual interactions with other humans, like by way of social media, and even parasocial relationships via social media with people that we don't necessarily know in person, but that we have relationships with digitally?
Yeah, there are data now on virtual interactions, mostly in terms of mood benefits. So, it's very well established. I mentioned earlier, the introverts, extroverts, both go to an hour-long interaction. Everybody feels better after, right? So it's well established that face-to-face contact makes us feel better. If you compare that sort of mood benefit to what people gain from interacting online, it's smaller. And specifically, the less lifelike the interaction is, the worse the benefits are. So a texting interaction is much less profound, positive impact on your mood than even a video call. Maybe not much less, but then in person. The video call will be a little bit better than texting. However, all of those things, any contact, even if virtual, is still better than no contact at all. And so that's why I'm curious about the question you asked before of AI versus nothing at all. I'd be really curious on that. I would bet there's probably some benefit, but it's probably a little bit smaller than texting with another human. But, I have a lot of thoughts on virtual interaction. I actually have a paper I published on this, but it's a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is basically that socializing online does not engage the brain's empathy areas the same way that interacting in person does. Because the way those empathy areas know that you are a human being is because you are making facial expressions, and I can hear your tone of voice, and I can see your body language. And there's all these social cues that my brain just soaks up and uses to form a model of what are you thinking, what are you going through. And that's how those brain areas turn on, right? Because, what other signals are there? Well, when we're online, let's say we're on X and we're, messaging back and forth, it's just text. The only sort of social cue I have is your avatar image, right? Otherwise, it's just words. There's no cue to tell my brain, turn on empathy. And so when that happens, and we're not experiencing and sharing the emotions of the other person, we're just much more hostile. We don't care, right? Because if I said something really mean to you right now, if I said something insulting, let's say about your appearance, you would feel bad, and I would witness you feeling bad. And so because of empathy and because of my brain perceiving and modeling your state, I would start to feel bad too. And so that's what keeps me from saying something mean. Obviously, that's not the only thing that keeps me. But in general, that's what holds us back from being hostile, is that you have to take on some element of the pain that you cause. But on social media,
all bets are off.
Yeah, that doesn't happen. I call that like the stepping on the tack phase. I have this analogy of you place a tack to prank someone, and then you forget all about it, you leave the room, and like a couple hours later or years later, someone steps on the tack, you're not in the room. Does a tree that falls in the woods make a sound, right? Does the person is experiencing pain, you caused the pain, but you're off somewhere else. You didn't see it, you don't see them crying. Do you feel empathy? Of course not, right? You have no idea. When you find out, if you pass them and you say, oh my gosh, what happened to you? Oh, I stepped on a tack. Now I feel horrible, right? But until that happens, which often never happens on social media, you don't feel anything. And so that's the stepping on the tack phase. We leave a comment, we place a tack. Screw you, you look fat, whatever it is. We don't have to be there when the person opens that comment and steps on the tack. And I think that's problematic. And even if they did reply, you hurt my feelings or something like that, you can understand, I hurt their feelings, they're feeling bad. But without witnessing their social cues, the brain areas that drive empathy just do not fire up to the same level. And there's also some other interesting evidence that so even on a video, if you're watching like a live stream versus a replayed video, and you're asked to guess what the person is experiencing, the brain areas that drive empathy are less active when it's a replayed video. And so you think about like Instagram or TikTok, where let's say I make a video explaining something about neuroscience, I post it, and people are watching it replayed, right? It's not live. It's at some point in the past I recorded it. Even though they can see my facial expressions and they can hear my tone of voice and they're getting those social cues, the fact that it's replayed may also inhibit empathy. And so there we go, placing tax again. And so I actually genuinely worry about this as like a substantial problem for humanity, because we spend a lot of time online. I think it's like 63% of the world uses social media, and the average person spends 2.5 hours online per day. So if you math that out, that amounts to like 10 or 11% of the entire world's attention every single day and time is spent on social media, where we have all these interactions happening that are full of harassment and hostility. And so in this paper I published, I basically was calling, like, it's a published paper, it's a peer-reviewed study. It's for mostly other neuroscientists to read. And I was like, let's study this. We need to spend time and resources studying these online interactions, because everybody is experiencing this, and our kids are being harassed. And, once people are harassed online, the rate of suicide goes up. It's a serious problem. And by the way, sorry for the long rant, but I obviously care about this.
Yeah, it's important.
The other thing too is that the recipient, even though you may think, well, they're also some distance from it, they still experience legitimate pain. And there's actually an overlap in the brain between social pain and physical pain. The brain activity is very similar. And the studies that we have from decades of neuroscience research to understand social pain is in the context of basically a virtual environment. So that because people are put in brain scanners, the MRI tube, you're in there, all you have is a little screen in front of you, and something insulting happens on the screen. Like maybe you are playing a game of catch in a virtual game, and then you get excluded from the group. You feel bad, you feel excluded. Social pain overlap with brain areas that are associated with physical pain. So our fundamental understanding of what it feels like and what the brain does when we experience social pain is from virtual interactions, and it shows like a legitimate impact on the brain. So I think the dynamic of online interactions is sort of tilted in that the recipient of a attack feels the full experience, whereas the perpetrator basically feels nothing, and it's just clear to move on with their life and not feel anything whatsoever.
I mean, but you've just painted the picture as to exactly why social media can be as toxic as it is, especially with all the mudslinging that goes on, especially today. I mean, because of the polarized world that we're currently inhabiting.
Oh, may I add? This is honestly why I wrote this book, is because you asked at the beginning, how has it changed your perspective, right? This is one of those things where I'm seeing how the world is changing, and I'm like, okay, this is a problem, right? Social media, I'm thinking about the empathy-related brain areas, right? Political polarization. Also a thing that's very concerning when it comes to empathy. So the brain's empathy areas, which, by the way, if anyone's curious, the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex are the two like emotional empathy brain areas. So when you witness something, let's say in pain, and you feel that sense of like, oh my gosh, I feel terrible for this person, or like I feel revolted, it's those areas. The prefrontal cortex is driving the understanding of someone else's experience. So those first two, the anterior cingulate and the insular cortex, studies have shown that if you witness, or participants in studies witness someone else experiencing pain, but that person is an out-group member basically anything, different race, different religion, different political affiliation, different sexuality, whatever it is, those areas are less active. And again, this makes sense because evolutionary perspective, it's most important to empathize with the people in your group. Because if you are, let's go way back, you're walking through the jungle. I don't even know if this makes sense, but you're walking through the jungle and you see a member of your tribe in battle with some tiger or something. It's important for you, for the sake of your survival and your group's survival, to say, oh my gosh, that person seems to be in pain, I need to help them, right? And so empathy helps you relate to them and motivates you to step in and support them. If it's a member of the opposite tribe and you feel the same level of empathy, that's actually a disadvantage, because now you're going to feel compassion for this person. You're going to step in and you're going to put your own life at harm. But that's not necessarily good for you, right? It's helpful. So evolutionarily, basically, the humans that were most likely to survive back in the day were the ones who were most connected emotionally with their own group. And so now here we are, we have the same thing where we experience more empathy for those in our same, any of those traits I just mentioned. But now we are becoming very, very good at identifying differences, whether that's, political, there you go. Right off the bat, 50% of the country is going to activate your empathy less. That's problematic. And then we're also identifying all these new sort of factors and variables that fit into someone's identity, like their gender identity, right? Their sexuality. I guess that's not necessarily true or necessarily new, but those are really coming to the surface, right? So in the past, it wasn't as salient who someone voted for or what someone's pronouns are, or all these things where you can look and say, that person's different from me, and therefore empathy goes down. And I think that's a major problem.
It is a problem. I mean, it's a neurobiological explanation for xenophobia.
Yeah.
Where you express, you express an idea that has even a whiff of xenophobia in it, and you're labeled a bigot or a racist or a homophobe or a transphobe or a, political grifter or whatever, right? But we forget, I think, at times, not only is there that lack of empathy that you eloquently described just because of the medium of social media. But we forget that we've inherited brains that have evolved to really, pay most attention to the local environment and linear progress, like linear growth. Whereas now we live in this exponential world and we're exposed with ideas from all over the world on the same newsfeed.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
Right. And, I think there's a much more common practice, I guess you would call it that, of you see something on social media, you just described it, right? You see something on social media that, let's say I saw a post that you posted and I've never met you and I disagree with it. And people are immediately like, okay, I don't like Max, right? And like, he's a bad person and everything he stands for is completely different from what I represent, right? And so therefore I'm mad. I might even throw a mean comment your way. I'm not going to follow you, whatever. Like we do that so much, right? Where we just place barriers immediately.
I see it all the time. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
And first off, I don't think that's good because then it's, this is how we end up in echo chambers. But the other thing is, if you think about we're online, so we're already at a distance, and then I perceive something that makes you different from me, then there's even more distance. And I think that's concerning because then our brains are, like my brain in that scenario would literally treat you differently. It is treating you differently. It's basically dehumanizing you to the point where it's not responding to you as a human and it's not trying to embody your emotions. I am in no way considering what would you feel when I leave a mean comment. But if we met in person and we were sitting here, if we were sitting right now and you said something despicable that I completely agreed with, I would still be like, well, you know what? I've been enjoying this conversation otherwise. Like, I'm not going to just like cast you off, right? And probably part of that is because we have this sort of synchrony going on and we have this connection and in-person connection matters. I think not only do we feel better from interacting online, but I think we're also, we have healthier interactions. And I also worry about for young people who are having more and more, I don't really know what it's like to be young in this day and age, but it seems that young people are having more and more interactions online, and maybe some of these like fundamental interactions where you go to school and then instead of seeing your friends, you come home and you're like FaceTiming or you're just on social media. And at least this is what I've heard. And in early life, our brains are establishing social models of the world. We are understanding, we're learning empathy. We're starting to understand what's right, what's wrong. We're shaping the development of certain brain areas like the prefrontal cortex through our social experiences. And if those social experiences are happening online in this digital environment that lacks important social cues and doesn't necessarily represent the full spectrum of a real human interaction, I have some concerns. I'm not super worried, but I have some concerns about how that alters the growth trajectory of a human brain and how that may result in a different social model of the world. And we may not fully understand what is and what isn't a violation of someone else's human rights and basically well-being, right? How the way we treat others online and what's acceptable online is not the same as what's acceptable and how we treat others in person. And so if you're training a human brain and the way it views the world on those interactions, I don't know if I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that the interactions that I have with people who follow me, who pay attention to my content, readers of my books, listeners to my podcast, my in-person interactions are 100% positive, 100% positive. And yet on social media, it's like I see these mudslingers and, it's just like ego and vitriol, and it's like it's mind-boggling to me. Yeah. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Mike Tyson: social media made y'all way too comfortable with disrespecting people and not getting punched in the face for it. And it's so true. I mean, it's a quote that perfectly encapsulates our times.
And he's the right person to say that quote too.
He is.
Because I would not want to offend Mike Tyson in person or online.
Definitely not. So how should people who are then the recipients of online mudslinging to handle when they see, when they get insults waged at them? Shrug it off?
Yeah, I honestly, that's my personal approach because I post online videos about neuroscience.
Yeah, you're a public figure.
And sometimes people are upset with what I've said or my appearance or whatever, or the picture on the wall behind me, whatever they choose to be upset about. And, at first I was like, man, I first off, I felt terrible, and I wanted to reason. I had the compulsion to try to reason with these people and state my case and, explain to them, and in a polite way too, and not to start an argument, but just to be like, hey, I think you misunderstood my point, this or that. And it often does not go anywhere. There have been cases where I have seemingly, I don't know if I did anything, but I feel like I've maybe converted someone to respecting me instead of disrespecting me, where like someone has followed me and I've always seen their comments, and in the beginning they were super negative and then they came around to being super positive, and like that's the best feeling in the world, because it's like, wow, I maybe transformed this person's like thoughts about science. But for the most part, when a mean comment comes in, I just ignore it, because one, it's not worth it, right? And the more that I engage, the more that I perseverate, and I just think about it all day, and you're glued to your phone, right? Once you start that interaction and that like argument, you're just thinking about like, what are they going to say next? What's my next comeback going to be, right? And I've been there. It's not healthy. It doesn't feel good at all. Whereas if I just shrug it off and I tell myself, you know what? That person probably would not have said that in person, and I bet they actually maybe don't even believe that. It's a lot easier to sort of neglect. And I've actually, the reason that I had that hypothesis in the first place was because I was working at Stanford studying the neurobiology of empathy, and specifically how we could enhance empathy. And then I had this experience online where it was on TikTok, and I had posted a video, and this other person made a video responding to me, and they just like shredded me. They were like, he's a narcissist, he's cherry picking data, like everybody knows neuroscientists are narcissists. And it was just like, for no reason, super aggressive. I done nothing inflammatory. Actually, the reason that they made that video was because they didn't like the music I used in the background. So I commented on the post, and I was just like, wow, you're really like coming for my head today. And the person, like next time I opened the app, I saw that they had left all these comments profusely apologetic. I am so sorry. I didn't think you'd see this. I just had a bad week. The music choice was just what like triggered me. I know that you don't cherry pick and that you're trying to make science more accessible, and that's important. Then they also sent me a DM on Instagram that was like a full page. It was so apologetic. And that's where it hit me, where up until that point, I had been like, man, people are really mean online, and it must mean that they're mean in person. But this person, they placed attack. When they realized that I had stepped on the attack, they actually felt empathy. And they were so compassionate that they went to the extent of apologizing. And that's where I realized, oh my gosh, this is a really empathetic person who wanted me to not feel bad, but they were still so careless with their empathy that they were driven to the extent of posting this video that was like very aggressive in the first place. And that's where I realized, oh my gosh, it's not that these are all evil people. It's that good people can fall prey to this very strange interaction format we have online and can commit acts of harm. And ever since then, that's what kind of got me thinking about, well, it makes sense. The brain areas that drive empathy would be disengaging, and that's when I published the paper. But I always think about that, where it's like, this person may have left a mean comment on my post today, but they probably don't even mean it, and maybe I misread it. Maybe they mispresented their thoughts, but we probably have a lot more in common than my brain wants me to think. And I'm not actually under fire as much as it feels like.
But it did cause you pain.
Yeah.
And we know that, emotional pain lights up the same pathways as you elucidated as physical pain.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it definitely hurts. And there's no secret to like, oh, I never feel anything when I see a mean comment. And my brain pays way more attention to the negative comments than the positive comments, right? People will be like, this is a great explanation. I'm like, sure, great. And then someone's like, you look stupid.
Because like, we have our negativity bias.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
So do you think that there's a neurobiological then justification for deleting negative comments, for blocking people? I mean, I know that kind of gets into like ethics and, decorum on social media, but I mean, why wouldn't you block somebody who's causing you, right? Like it's like your profile. You don't have to have that person around.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't block anyone because I think that just exacerbates the problem. When someone's angry and then you take away their privilege of being angry at you, they get angrier. They don't get less angry, right? And sometimes that can aggravate a situation and make someone even more upset. I just let them comment, right? Because it's just sort of like, hey, this is the wild, wild World Wide Web, right? You can post whatever you want, go for it. And frankly, also what usually happens is that the people who agree with me are usually pretty also aggressive in response to that person. And so there's usually sort of a swarm against that person. And then I see it all the time. I wish it didn't happen. I'll be getting notifications for like 4 or 5 days after I post something where these two people are still arguing back and forth. And it's like a chain of 150 comments because they just have been arguing for days, and it's horrible.
It's great for the algorithm.
I guess so, maybe, yeah. But so I just leave it there. But I do wish that people would just kind of stop altogether, and whether they're the one being mean or the one being mean to the person being mean, it's kind of all for nothing.
Yeah. So how has your research then made you, how has it changed your approach to social connection then? Has it made you more proactive? I mean, what's the takeaway for listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I view socializing every day as a part of my sort of like wellness routine, I guess, right? Like exercise, diet, sleep, interaction. Am I getting enough interaction? How do I feel? I also try to be just like I want to say a good friend. I always try and be a good friend, obviously, but also a reliable friend. I try not to like flake on plans and stuff. Like I follow through. And because also that's another key point is that there's a lot of sort of bad predictions in our brains when it comes to socializing that makes us way more likely to flake at the last minute. Like that pressure that you feel when you're like, oh my gosh, I wish I didn't commit to this. I don't feel like leaving the house. I'm so tired. This interaction is just going to be more draining. Like that is very natural to experience. And so whenever I bump up against that barrier, I always make a point to push through it. And I always feel better after going to whatever social function it is. But so, yeah, I just try to build in as much interaction as possible. And the other thing that I do is I always try to set aside any perceived differences. Like I will welcome all people into my life, and this is cheesy, but like into my heart. Like I will love anybody who, it doesn't matter how different they are from me. And what I've found is that while it may be sometimes a little bit harder to love someone or to care for someone who is very, very different from me, and even if they believe in things that I completely disagree with, on the other side of that barrier is actually a great sense of satisfaction, where the comfort that comes from befriending what your brain wants to perceive as your enemies comes with a sense of safety, right? Because it's like, oh, this perceived threat is actually no threat at all. Now they are an ally. And so I just try to, I don't know, I guess be the person who welcomes anybody, and for the sake of my brain health, not only for the sake of good relationships, but I think that my brain is genuinely healthier for it. And so it's kind of kumbaya, but it's like, hey, if we all did this, A, humankind would be way healthier, and B, our cultures and societies would be way healthier in different ways, and so maybe if I can motivate people to be kind and supportive and caring of others for selfish purposes, for the sake of their own brain health, maybe that is one step towards kind of healing the divide that is sort of fracturing all over our society.
Amen. Well, Dr. Rein, thank you so much for coming out, for writing this book. I know the book comes out this week. Super excited. Is this your first book?
Yeah, this is my first book. And this copy is like one of the first I've ever held. So
oh, wow.
It's my pleasure to gift it to you.
Amazing. Well, mazel tov. Thank you, brother, for writing it. It's super important today more than ever. So I've got one last question for you. But before we get to that, where can listeners, I know that you're very active on social media. You put out a lot of great content. And so how can people connect with you there, and where can they pick up your book?
So, book is everywhere. Why Brains Need Friends is the title. Should be available probably everywhere, maybe everywhere. And then online, my name is, so Dr. Ben Rein, Rein is the last name, how it's spelled. But also my website, my name, benrein.com, for if anybody wants to read my scientific papers, God bless your soul if you're interested in that. But also a contact form, and I have some resources on there for students and things like that. There's all sorts of little fun things on there. So, but yeah, please feel free to reach out with any questions or anything.
Hell yeah. Why brains need friends. Love it. Last question that gets asked everybody on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
Gosh, I think it's identifying your needs and meeting them, right? Like for instance, I have had blood work done. I have a vitamin D deficiency and a magnesium deficiency. So I take those supplements, right?
We can help you out with that.
Yeah. Fun fact, I have narcolepsy, sleep disorder. I need like 8 hours of sleep to function. I structure my entire life around getting my 8 hours of sleep so that I can function and operate, as a neuroscientist by day without falling asleep and being overwhelmed by the computational power required for my daily tasks. So I think, living a genius life means listening to your body, recognizing your strengths and weaknesses, and building a life around that to allow you to thrive.
Amazing. Well said. Well, thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for listening. Share this episode around, and sending love to all you guys out there, wherever you happen to be. I will catch you on the next episode. Peace, everybody. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.